In this lecture, which most students will find the most challenging of the series, we turn our focus to one of the most influential and difficult thinkers of all time, Immanuel Kant. If Burke's inquiry helped introduce epistemology into the world of aesthetics, then Kant's critique of judgment transformed that introduction into a full-blown science. Through a close analysis of Kant's critique, we shall explore Kant's central assertion that aesthetic judgments constitute a subjective universality. Having defined fully this epistemological concept, we shall then proceed to unpack a series of key Kantian distinctions. Now, as we said in the last lecture, Kant is going to pick up where Burke left off. And so, at the very outset of his critique, Kant is going to assert that the judgment of the beautiful is purely subjective. In other words, just as we saw in Burke, Kant is going to argue that beauty and the judgment of the beautiful has nothing to do with the beautiful object per se, but with the way it is perceived by a subject. Please remember that from the last lecture. We're not talking about the object, but the way it is perceived by the subject. Kant agrees totally with Burke in that area. Now, according to Kant, the judgment of beauty, or judgments of beauty, are not cognitive. They are not logical. They are not rational. Instead, they are aesthetic. Let me go on a slight tangent here to tell you something about Kant. Kant, I would say, is the epistemological version of Aristotle. Aristotle was an ontologist, and therefore Aristotle wrote a treatise on every single discipline. Remember we talked about that? On the nature of every discipline, he wrote a treatise. Well, Kant says, why do Aristotle all over again? What Kant does, is he writes a treatise on every single one of our mental faculties. You see, that is an epistemological project. And so instead of writing a treatise on poetry and philosophy and ethics and politics like Aristotle, he writes a treatise on reason, on understanding, on imagination. In other words, he tries to categorize and define the various mental faculties or modes of perception that we as human beings use. I think that will help us to understand Kant. Now, reason and imagination, those as modes of perception, those are logical, cognitive, rational. But the aesthetic judgment is, again, aesthetic or purely subjective. That's what distinguishes it as a mental faculty from reason or understanding. Now, let's put it more specifically. Whereas cognitive judgments, reason and understanding, presuppose fixed ideas and work to establish fixed concepts, aesthetic judgments work through our feelings and neither rest on any concept nor seek to generate any. You see, the cognitive mental faculties are interested in concepts and setting up concepts and setting up criteria and ideas. The aesthetic judgment is not interested. It works with feeling and it doesn't try to generate any concepts. Aesthetic judgments are also free of all ends or purposes. What Kant adds to subjectivity is this idea that the subjective is totally free. It doesn't seek any kind of end. It doesn't seek any kind of concept. It doesn't seek any purpose or goal. It is absolutely and purely free and subjective. In fact, what Kant says is that should an aesthetic judgment seek an end, that end would actually be an end in itself. In other words, aesthetic judgments are ends in themselves. They're full and complete, and they don't seek something else like reason or understanding often do. If the aesthetic judgment were to seek a purpose, it would be a purposeless purpose. Kant loves to use these crazy phrases. Let me put it this way. If somebody were to go up to Kant and say, Mr. Kant, aesthetics and poetry is useless, do you know what he would say? Exactly. You got it right. It is useless. It has nothing to do with ends or purposes or concepts. It's purely free. Notice I said one way to answer Plato is to create a separate sphere for poetry and the aesthetic. That is what Kant is doing to the nth degree. He is not only making a different area for poetry, but poetry uses a whole different mode of perception. One that is aesthetic, that has to do with judgment. Let's continue what we're doing here. That is to say, both subject and object are perceived as being complete and perfect within themselves. In the aesthetic judgment, there are no ulterior ends or purposes. It's an end in itself. That phrase comes up 100 times in the Critique of Judgment. Now, Kant, being very systematic and a good logician, one of the ways he helps to define the beautiful is by distinguishing it from other things. And so first he distinguishes it from the pleasurable, and then he distinguishes the beautiful or the aesthetic from the good. First, let's look at the difference between the beautiful, that's the same thing as the aesthetic, and the pleasurable. Whereas the pleasurable is an interested emotion that seeks some kind of gratification from the object, the beautiful is purely disinterested. It seeks nothing from the object and makes no demands on it. A very loose analogy would be the two Greek words for love, eros and agape, right? Eros is physical love. You want to possess the beloved. That's the pleasurable. Agape is selfless love, right? You don't want to possess anything. You don't want to control it. You want to love. And so, very loosely speaking, the beautiful is more like agape, whereas the pleasurable is more like eros. Indeed, the beautiful is so unconcerned with any kind of gratification that it is even unconcerned as to whether the object exists or not. It can be a fiction. It can be a unicorn. But that's okay, because the point of the beautiful is not to possess the object. It's not seeking gratification. It is pure and free and an end in itself. All right, let's distinguish the beautiful now from the good. Whereas the good seeks beauty as a means to some higher end, the beautiful accepts it unconditionally as a finished thing in itself. Let's look at something like an icon, religious sculpture or a religious painting, an icon. If you're interested in the good, you're interested in how that icon can lead you to God, which is another end. But if you look at it aesthetically, you're interested in it as an end in itself, not where it can take you or what it can do for you, but as an end in itself. That is the beautiful. All right, we're working our way up to the central definition in all of Kant. Although the judgment of beauty is purely subjective, Kant says, it is paradoxically universally felt, and therefore it constitutes a subjective universality. This is as important to Kant as it is to Burke. Remember, Burke said the same thing. It's subjective. We all feel it, by ourselves individually, but it's universal. Now, for Burke, you'll remember his proof of subjective universality is that since imagination and taste is based on senses and the senses are universal, therefore taste is universal. Now, I think Kant would agree with that, but Kant comes up, I think, with a much more subtle, in-depth answer to this. Let me explain what he bases the subjective universal on. According to Kant, what allows the aesthetic subjective judgment to be felt universally is the very fact that it is purely subjective and therefore untainted by any ulterior interests or inclinations. When we're looking for the aesthetic, there are no agendas, there are no political agendas, there's no goals, there's no hidden agendas. We say no kind of thing we're looking for. We're not trying to prove anything or anything. It's just it's free. And so what he says is, since, number one, the beautiful does not work in accordance with any concepts. Two, as it is free and disinterested. In fact, two, and then three, it is even indifferent to the existence of the object. Then it must also be free of all prejudice and external restraint. And what he's trying to say is that if we all feel it freely, without any prejudice or restraint or agendas, then we all must feel it the same. Now, this notion of Kant, which is absolutely central to his aesthetic, is attacked in modern day. According to modern theorists, this is ridiculous because there's no such thing as a purely free, disinterested response. To modernists, everything is political. There's nothing that's free from a political agenda or ideology. So they throw that out. Postmodernists say not everything is political, but everything is relative. There is no such thing as universality. So I want you to know that Kant has taken a lot of beating in the last 100 years for this idea. But whether you agree with Kant or not, we must understand this concept because it is absolutely central to Kant. Whether we agree with it, he agrees that it's both subjective and universal, and it's universal because it's free from all agendas and ideologies. Now, let's put it this way. Why is it so important? Why do we need this paradox? For Kant, the aesthetic realm, if it's going to be free, has got to be subjective. It's got to be subjective or it won't be free. If it's objective, it's not going to be free. So to be free, it must be aesthetic. But if that realm is to offer itself as a field for critical analysis and systematic study, it must be universal. So in order to be free, it's got to be subjective. But in order to allow us to set up rules and regulations, as the systematic Kant wants to do, it's got to be universal. And again, Kant is like Burke. If it wasn't universal, if I can't set up any criteria, then why do it? It's useless. I told you I'm going to be using some Christian analogies. Let me use the analogy of Christ. According to Christian theology, Jesus is 100% man and 100% God. Just like for Kant, it's 100% subjective and 100% universal. Now in Christianity, Jesus must be a man or he can't die. But at the same time, he must be God or his death will not be universal for salvation. So oddly, there's a little link there. In the same way Jesus has to be both, so does the aesthetic have to be both, subjective and universal. Now, according to Kant, typically taste is not universally valid, for taste is linked to pleasure. The charm of the object gratifies the taste and monopolizes its focus. So often when we talk about taste, we're gratified. That means there's a purpose or an end, and therefore it's not pure. However, Kant says, or he posits, there is a purer, higher kind of taste that is more aesthetic. And that's a taste that focuses on form. Now, why is taste that focuses on form free and aesthetic? Well, the reason is that according to Kant, a poem's form may be studied as an end in itself, as a purposeless purpose. And as such, it can lie within the realm of the aesthetic judgment. We are saying form as opposed to content. The content of a poem, the moral, if you will, is something that changes with each age. But for Kant, the form is something that is pure and eternal. It doesn't change. And the form of the poem has no agenda. It's an end in itself. It's a purposeless purpose. And therefore, it is good fodder, if you will, for the aesthetic judgment. So formal taste is aesthetic. Now, this formalist element in Kant may be traced back to Aristotle's preference for plot over character. Think about it. Plot is much closer to form, whereas character is much closer to content. And so Kant is, in this sense, an Aristotelian. He, too, will privilege plot because plot is linked to form, and form is pure and eternal, and therefore aesthetic. Hope we're following all these links here. Now, this idea, it starts in Aristotle. Kant picks it up, and we're going to hear it again in Unit 5 when we talk about the new critics. That's lectures 17 to 20. They, too, will pick up on this idea of poetry as a self-enclosed aesthetic artifact, something that is an end in itself, that is perfect and pure. Again, has no ideologies, no agendas. It's not seeking something, no ulterior motives. I'm repeating myself, but partly because Kant repeats himself again and again. In fact, right now, I want to remind you of something. And I'm going to do this because Kant reminds us of this incessantly in his critique. And what I want to remind you of is that although it sounds like I'm talking about beauty as residing in the object, I want you to remember that whenever I talk about beauty, I'm still talking about the subject. In other words, it's hard to talk about this. It sounds as if I'm saying beauty is in the object, in the form of the object. But remember, this is still epistemology. Finally, beauty resides in the subject. And again, Kant was trying to find a new way to talk about this, because whatever way we say it, it sounds like we're talking about the object. It's hard to talk about subjective response. But that's what Kant is trying to do. And again, he reminds us again and again that even though he sounds like he's being objective, he is being subjective.